Hello and welcome to the inaugural broadcast, I guess, of the Construction Record, a DCN and JOC podcast. I'm Warren Frey, the digital media editor for the JOC, or Journal of Commerce, and this is...
I'm Russell Hixson. I'm a staff writer for the Journal of Commerce. Hello.
And we're going to go into, we're going to do a few things. First off, we've got us talking about what we've done this week and what we're going to do the next. Then we got Versace and Lindsey from Toronto giving us the hot scoop from what's going on in daily commercial news. And they're going to talk extensively about the Canadian Construction Association in Mexico, which is coming up in about a week or so, their big conference, which I'll be going to and I'll mention, but they go into great detail. But in the meantime, we're going to talk to Russ about what he's doing this week.
Yeah, there's two things that you're going to see in the JOC pretty soon. First, Site C Dam project. There's been something interesting going on there. Last month they found a 400-meter tension crack, and they had to reassign about 30 workers who were building a road there. And this is interesting because this is kind of a known issue in the Peace River area. There was a failure of a bridge in I think 1957, the Peace River Bridge in Taylor, that was attributed to geological activity like this. So it remains to be seen how big of an issue this is going to be currently on the project and going forward, because these soil conditions exist. So right now, BC Hydro is working to assess the area, and we'll just kind of see what happens. It could impact the project greatly, it could not, but it's definitely interesting for such a large project like this, if this is going to become an issue.
At minimum, how much does a thing like that cost, just in terms of manpower and money and all the rest of it? I don't want actual figures, but just kind of a general idea how big a deal that is.
I mean, the section that's affected by this 400-meter tension crack, I believe it's a piece where the dam connects to on the side of the river, on the north bank. If they can't get in there and it's disabled, this soil is unstable, I mean, obviously I'm not an engineer or anything like that, but it could be very significant in terms of cost and time and manpower. It could be a huge pain. But obviously they have planned for things like this. They know that the soil there is like this. It's something that's been on their mind. So I'm sure that they have planned for it, right? Mm-hmm. But it could definitely be an issue. But it's a little too early to say at this point, I think.
And what else you got coming up?
Also, the Kias Dam, and this is an example of what can happen when you don't plan for things, maybe. The Kias Dam is a similar project. It's a hydroelectric project as well. And it just announced that they've had to raise their budget by $2.2 billion with a B.
Ouch.
So that's basically adding the cost of a modern bridge to your project. That's basically a Portman bridge added onto your project. And essentially, they've been doing structural concrete work for about a year. And after doing that, they have come out and said that this is a more realistic estimate based on what they know now. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me like they started work on this project a little bit blind maybe, and without doing as much work up front to determine cost and different things like that. So they've had some of the things they've added is $900 million in contingency funds, interest, and escalation to address scheduling and construction risk. So that's not an easy pill for taxpayers to swallow.
No sir, it is not.
Yeah, $2.2 billion. That's pretty heavy. So yeah.
All right, here's what I did over the last week. I went to the Wood, let me get this right because it's confusing. It's the Wood Design and Construction Solutions Conference. It's a mouthful. Right. And basically I've had this for a few years now, and it's sort of a gathering of, it used to be just design guys, but a lot of it now is engineering and other stuff besides design, and a design component. So one of the things I took in and wrote a blog about in an article was a guy who uses indigenous architecture principles on newer buildings. And with sort of high-end and cutting-edge wood technology. And this guy's name is Alfred Waugh from Foreign Line Architecture in Vancouver. So basically, in the article that I profile, there's one bandstand in this remote area, and it's got this weird undulating wood roof, which you couldn't really do without computers and the kind of new technology you've got with wood. There's a building that's based on the whole longhouse concept, but unlike, he didn't want to make it into a black box, he said, so it's like a transparent longhouse, which is, and longhouses are like the traditional sort of West Coast First Nations buildings that you'll see if you go to like Haida Gwaii, that kind of place. So it's a real interesting just how he takes all those different principles and sort of moves them towards modern and specifically wood-based architecture, which was kind of cool. As for what I got coming up, like I said before, I'm going to go to the Canadian Construction Association's big shindig. Isn't really fair because a lot of work gets done down there in Mexico. So next week we'll be flying down and we'll be covering everything from all their board meetings to all the policy they're going to make, and the federal budget's coming out at the exact same time. So we're going to be able to get reactions to that from people in the construction industry right there, almost in real time, which is kind of cool. Like I said before, I'll let Lindsey and Vince hash over that in greater detail. And why don't we listen to them right now?
Hello everyone, this is Vince Versace, National Managing Editor of the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce.
And this is Lindsey Cole, the editor of the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce.
And hey Lindsey, so I guess we're going to talk about some of the front burner stories that are happening here on the Daily Commercial News side. And as well, we're going to cover some of the important initiatives we got on the national front that we're going to be covering via the DCN and the JOC.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a lot on the go. So on the DCN spectrum, our reporter Don Wall is working on a number of stories, but one that I think is kind of interesting is a story he's doing on resilient infrastructure. It's a term that's becoming more and more familiar in the construction industry. So basically, he's focusing on a recent report and release that was sent out where the National Research Council and Infrastructure Canada are upgrading some codes and specifications, creating guidelines, all pertaining to resilient infrastructure, which is essentially more of, I would say, a proactive approach to building infrastructure that can withstand climate change, because studies consistently shown that there's more and more flooding, more high winds, more earthquakes and whatnot. So the government's essentially throwing some money towards some study and some changes to make sure that our buildings can withstand future weather conditions. So it's pretty interesting. I know that you've probably seen some coverage along the way on this topic, Vince.
Yeah. Well, the thing is with the resilient infrastructure, it's top of mind for a lot of people, but it also kind of speaks to technological advancement that our industry can participate in and engage in as far as projects to make them better, more efficient, and serve a longer lifespan and life cycle than they typically do now, using old construction methods and old materials that really helped build up Canada in the 50s and 60s during that building boom. Corky Corlock, our columnist, has always got some really great stuff on resilient infrastructure.
Yeah.
So whenever we can complement those stories via staff, I think it's really kind of an information piece and an education piece for the industry when we do those types of things.
Yeah, and like we say, it's been coming up more and more at various seminars and events and topics and whatnot. So it's something we want to keep an eye on for sure. Another area that's been kind of an ongoing coverage topic for us that our reporter Angela Gismondi is covering is prompt payment. So not only is that been a huge discussion here in Ontario with the Construction Lean Act review ongoing, and that report released a number of recommendations when it comes to addressing prompt payment. It's something that, our industry has consistently been trying to improve for many years. I know you've been on this file for...
Yeah, it's close to 9 years now,
Yeah.
actually, the more I think about it. And what's always fascinating to me about stories like this, like prompt payment, is you'll hear people say that the construction industry is very fractured. It has a lot of entrenched groups that really like to take care of their own backyard and not necessarily are they willing to compromise and work with the folks on the other side of the fence. And I think the prompt payment issue has been that in a nutshell from its inception. But one of the things that have changed really is you had to have both sides in the argument really start to come together here in Ontario around prompt payment. wasn't just a supplier problem. It starts to become when people start to acknowledge that it's just not a supplier problem, it's just not a subs problem, it's also a GC problem as well. It's everybody in that construction chain. So the story has evolved so much to the point now that we've had this review, the Reynolds review of the Lean Act. And their ongoing consultation is something I think is admirable. Something that in 9 years of kind of seeing this story grow and move forward and become complicated and then die in the vine and then come back to life again. It's admirable to see that we're at this stage now where there almost is full-fledged new Lean Act legislation that can come through.
Absolutely. Not only that, but I think it's really telling that after all these years and after such a comprehensive review, a lot of the stakeholders who provided feedback are now on the same page. And that's something that I think is again, admirable on the Reynolds report side. I mean, they really tried to address a lot of stakeholders. And I think we have a lot of associations that are pleased with the outcome of that report and are waiting to see how it's going to be implemented. And I mean, obviously one of the associations is the CCA. Yeah. So the Canadian Construction Association is pretty much kept its finger on the pulse when it comes to this file and is continuing to try to advocate and for the industry and pursue some guidelines and measures with the federal government. So that's where Angela's story, I think, is going to take its focus, is on what the CCA is doing with the federal government to try to encourage some measures to be taken there. So there's lessons to be learned from the Reynolds report, and I think that the CCA is taking a good hard look at that, and then on top of that, we'll see where things go on a national spectrum.
Well, that's the thing. The CCA, once they became involved, as their own members started to say to them, what is our stand on this? What advice do we have? CCA being in an interesting position because they are a federal body, and this was a jurisdictional provincial issue across Canada, but particularly here in Ontario because the Lean Act was being reviewed. It's given them an opportunity, and it's also given the other jurisdictions in Canada to really look and see what can we do to improve the money flow through the construction supply chain. And the eyes of Canada are looking at Ontario. Yep. Essentially, not to exaggerate, but a lot of provinces are looking to see how this shakes out here as far as prompt payment. So whenever we see on the federal side of things, CCA and the federal industry stakeholders engaging with the federal government to see what can be improved around prompt payments, it really is a sign that bettering the money flow on projects for everybody involved is top of mind for everyone.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so those are, I think, two pretty topical stories that our reporters are pursuing. So I'll be eager to see what they end up getting from some interviews that they're conducting.
Yeah, and on the topic of money, this is the other thing that's interesting. I know Lindsey's got the troops already starting to line up for it. We have the federal budget that's been announced on March 22nd. That's going to be unveiled. And for us here at the Daily Commercial News and the Journal of Commerce, it's an exciting time for us. We love covering the federal budget. It's kind of our Super Bowl of budget coverage, really, between the two papers. And typically we are in the lockup in Ottawa. But this year we won't be able to get there because we have quite a few resources committed to being at the CCA conference in Mexico. And but it's still something we're going to be covering on the ground there in Mexico because there's a lot of key federal stakeholders from construction and engineering that are going to be attending that conference.
It's actually a really great opportunity to have all those voices almost together in one spot. So we'll be able to see their reaction as the budget unfolds, which is a really unique opportunity from a reporting spectrum. I think we always want to see how people react to what's being announced in a budget. So we have a really cool chance to get some interviews done right after the budget's released, which I'm eager to do. So, and there's a lot of various elements in the budget that's going to be unveiled that I think are going to make for some discussion points that will be fairly newsworthy to our readers. So, I mean, we have, I think, some topic areas in terms of Trump across the border and what he's doing, and I think there's going to be some speculation as to what is going to be in the budget that might address some concerns from him. Don't you think?
I think so, because you keep on hearing the banter and the speculation from south of the border around protectionist measures as it concerns possibly some projects and material acquisition for projects, i.e. only American steel is going to be used on this American project. For the Canadian industry, when we hear things like that in our different sectors that the Canadian construction represents, it's a big deal for us because the U.S. is a massive partner and a massive influencer even on construction here in Canada. We have a lot of stakeholders here that play in the American construction space. So it'd be interesting to see what the federal budget may or may not have to help mitigate any possible damage that could come from that. But really the budget in the end, got to think that a lot of our industry are looking at what are the infrastructure dollars that are going to be promised in light of kind of the somewhat at times dire reflections that are being an analysis of the current Canadian economy, and can this Liberal government continue to promise what it's promised in its infrastructure spend? I think that's something that we're going to be keeping an eye on. That's going to be important. People are going to expect us to cover that.
For sure, and there's been some speculation and some coverage recently basically stating that the current Liberal government hasn't exactly fulfilled the first phase of its promise when it comes to infrastructure dollars. There's been some criticisms with regards to that, so we'll have to see if there's like an actual phased out plan that really gives maybe a timeline as to when those dollars could be rolled out.
And that's the thing with our industry, it's not even so much about the dollars half the time, as most people know that would be listening to this. It's about being able to execute and deliver on the projects, being able to have the labor available, the machinery available, the materials available to meet any guidelines that are attached to federal dollars or dollars that are shared with other jurisdictions, both provincially and on the municipal level. And I always find the budget interesting as well, because we like to see if there are any initiatives or incentives that are set aside around apprenticeship and skills training and attracting youth to the industry. Though sometimes those matters are provincial in jurisdiction, people do turn to the federal government for some advice or participation or insight on the matter.
Yeah, and grants or funding mechanisms where they can apply for things that will help stimulate that type of that portion of the economy with skilled trades and with apprentices. And it's also, I think, with minority groups, there's been a focus on that in the past as well.
Yeah.
So women, Aboriginal people with disabilities. Be interesting to see if there's any endeavors in the budget addressing that.
Well, what I find interesting too is when we hold up our budget coverage, I was reviewing that the other day, from last year, so the first Trudeau budget, you look at the headlines that we delivered for with a construction angle on the stuff that was in that budget. There were budgets that were called, funding that was called social infrastructure funding, green infrastructure funding. Those commitments were lauded, appreciated last year when they were put foot to the fore. Our industry seemed receptive to it, but always asking the question how and when. What happens with this budget? You know, do they continue in that vein, or with the social infrastructure type funding and green infrastructure type funding, or do they turn their eye more to more of the nuts and bolts traditional type of infrastructure funding around transit, transportation, schools, and institutions? So,
or even resource development. That might be another area of interest because, you know, there's been a heck of a lot of discussion lately about pipelines and resource development. You know, obviously in BC, LNG's big. Out here, there's been, like I said, a lot of pipeline discussion. So it'd be interesting to see if there's any mention of that.
And like you mentioned, the fact that we're going to have a team down in Mexico at the CCA conference to see the reaction to what gets announced in the budget is something that will be of great value to our readers and our listeners, I'm pretty sure. And overall, the CCA conference in general is something that we think is a signature event for us to cover in the industry, almost a stage setter for most of the year. And it's such a varied conference with so many different types of keynote speakers and specialized panels that it gives us a wealth of content to report on, I think.
Yeah, there's never a shortage of interesting seminars that are being discussed, and keynote speakers. They're always really interesting to hear from. I'm looking forward to this year because there's some different topics on the table that I think the industry really wants and needs to know about. One of them is legalizing marijuana and its impact for construction employers. We just recently had a story in the DCN by Don Wall on this very topic, and it's an area of concern. It's a bit of a gray area if you're on an employer on a construction site. It's hard to know where your parameters are and what measures you have and whatnot in order to deal with this potential of changing of the legislation to legalize marijuana. So I'm very interested to see what the speaker has to say on that one, because that's a very different topic. So social procurement and corporate social responsibility is also on the agenda. You mentioned in the budget that they had the whole social aspect for the infrastructure dollars. Well, there's also this whole aspect of social procurement. What's the community benefit that's going to be attached to projects and whatnot. And, if you're looking at signing on to do a project, you kind of want to know what's required of you in the community benefit portion of it. So it's really an interesting area for the industry because, how far does that go? What does it mean? What's involved in the procurement process? I mean, there's a lot of elements there that and questions that need to be answered. And I think the CCA is hosting this, in my mind, as a way to try to answer some of those questions.
Yeah.
So I think it'll be pretty cool. There's going to be a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and for us, for those of you that are longtime readers of the DCN and the JOC, and you may have attended the CCA conference in the past, you've known we've always delivered we call it a pony edition, a smaller edition of our day-to-day news that would be slipped under your hotel room door in the morning as we, the reporters on the ground, feverishly file for deadline every day before. This year, we're not going to actually have the pony editions down in Mexico, but we're really excited because as the CCA has looked at making their conference more greener, they've introduced a conference app over the last couple of conferences. And this year, it will be the first year actually that our news is going to get distributed through the app. So if you're going to be at the CCA conference and you download the CCA app, there is a news button, a news section in that app through which the Journal of Commerce and Daily Commercial News stories are going to be shared daily through there. We think it's a cool, new, innovative way for us to deliver our news and in real time. Because there's no guarantee with our old way of doing the pony editions that everybody would get a chance to read everything in that miniature version. As popular as it was, I got to admit, it was always a kick to see it by poolside or at the buffet lunch, people reading our little newspaper. But the one thing is with this app, you've seen people always using it at the conference.
Yeah, and people always have their phones in hand, so it makes sense for us to be a part of that. Yeah,
and so I think we're going to be able to deliver a lot of content through there, both conference coverage, content that we're creating through a couple of other initiatives, as well as this podcast. Will be made available through that news section as well on the podcast.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about rolling that out. Yeah, we got a number of interesting endeavors on the go. I know we have a fairly big one. So
exactly. One of the on March 20th, the first of our first 5 parts on our first ever national editorial series is called Building Canada 150. Essentially, we decided through our 2 newspapers that are heritage brands that have been covering the industry almost collectively 200 years, between the history of the JOC and the DCN. We decided we should cover the role construction has had in building this great country of ours. And the first part's going to roll out on March 20th, the first day of the conference in Mexico. We figured it's a perfect audience to roll out these construction-related national stories. It's a good dose of Canadiana, being abroad, I would say. So
absolutely. And we've got some really awesome stories to tell that helped change the face of Canada. I mean, construction played a huge role in that, so we really want to celebrate that.
Yeah, so it's called Building Canada 150. The first part is about transformational projects. So the projects that transformed Canada, that linked communities, increased commerce, and pretty much built the nation that we enjoy today. And there are some typical stories. There are stories that I'm sure people know are the national transformational story. Without saying the CPR Railroad, our railroad that connected us from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, being built in 5 years in the late 1800s, with the technology they had then, is an amazing feat. Mm-hmm. And our recent Twitter poll that we were running about what do people think is the most transformational project to impact Canada? By far, the CPR came in top via our Twitter poll. Other stories in that first part are going to be about the Trans-Canada Highway, about the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Ambassador Bridge, the Red River Floodway in Winnipeg, and also the CNR Railroad as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good cross-section of what helped build this nation up, and frankly, the work that went into it. I mean, I don't think it's any secret that a lot of lives were lost on these projects, but with the intent that these people sacrificed their lives, and we should pay homage to that.
For sure. And the other 4 parts, too, are going to look at different aspects of construction's contribution to Canada. Our second part will be about labor and workplace evolution, which is a big deal. We're going to speak to some of those elements that you just spoke to now. Construction's always a dangerous place to work. It was even more dangerous back then as this country was growing.
Exactly.
Regardless of the building boom that was underway. So labor and workplace evolution is going to be an interesting piece when it runs. The next one after that, that's going to come out just before the Canada Day weekend, is our iconic projects part. And I think that's a pretty cool one because, we want to highlight the projects that define Canada, right? And also highlight the construction expertise that helped make them a reality.
And the vision behind some of these projects. I mean, they're obviously, some of them are going to be pretty unique and stand out among our Canadian landscape. So it'll be really cool to see how those came together.
Yeah. Well, actually, you got one of those stories, I think.
I do.
You're on the slate to deliver one of those iconic project stories.
I am. I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, well, you know what, not to give it away what you're working on.
Yeah, I can't tell.
But you're excited to get involved.
Absolutely.
In that part. So what's kind of the approach you're thinking in trying to tackle one of these projects that we've determined as iconic?
I think my approach in tackling it will be, I would really like to, because I have the ability to with the project I'm looking at, I think I'd like to get some first-person perspectives if I could.
Yeah.
I think it'd be really cool to hear what it meant to them to be working on that project, if possible. I think with any story, you got to do your extensive research when you're tackling something of this importance, frankly. So I'm excited to tackle that. And the vision, like I said before, the vision behind some of these things. How the heck did it come to fruition, you know? So I'm excited to look into that without giving too much away.
Yeah, no, for sure. And we don't want to give out too much away to the readers, but definitely, if you're following us on Twitter, on DCN and the JOC, we're going to have weekly polls asking questions to our construction audience. As well, if you go to dcnonl.com or joconl.com, you see the stories that we're working on Building Canada 150, because the stories also go beyond just the 5 parts. We're endeavoring to have consistent content on this series throughout the year.
Yeah.
Right?
It's an opportunity for us. You know, it's not every day you get a chance to cover 150th anniversary of our country. So we want to capitalize on that and really do it justice.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And one key thing as we look down the road, all the content that we're going to create through the series in the 5 parts, it'll culminate into a really dynamic and awesome Leaders magazine. Leaders magazine being that magazine we put out every year that celebrates the best in construction in Canada. The fact is we'll be able to create a commemorative issue, 150th Canadian commemorative issue, and that's something that excites our entire team to be a part of.
Absolutely.
To actually kind of create this piece that could be a coffee table type issue that people keep around and keep in the office.
Yeah, keep for years to come.
Yeah.
So I think we're really excited about this initiative.
For sure. And with that, I think we'll just throw back to the guys in BC.
Alrighty.
Hey, thanks Vince, and thanks Lindsey. And up next, we've got an interview with Jock Finlayson. He's the chief economist from the Business Council of British Columbia, and we talked to him at Buildex a few weeks ago. So just as a note, he talks about a recent meeting between Trudeau and Trump that had just happened at the time. Obviously, a few weeks have passed since then. But most of the stuff he talks about is pretty solid economic analysis that was going to apply for the next year or 2 or 3. So without further ado, here's Jock. guess I'll start with, you were talking about how there is definitely some uncertainty south of the border, so maybe we could go with what the uncertainties are so far.
Well, it's not just south of the border, but that's got, I guess that's number one. Obviously, you have a new administration that's got off to a bumpy start, and a president who defied the pundits by winning the election, and whose agenda for change is quite unorthodox, if I could use that term. And so we'll have to see how that sorts out. The markets seem pretty upbeat on the U.S., the financial markets, particularly the stock markets, but I think a lot of companies and investors will be sort of sitting and waiting to see what Mr. Trump does on taxes, on trade, on immigration, and on infrastructure in particular, because all of those things will bear on the growth potential of the U.S. economy over the next 2 to 3 years. And it'll help to clarify whether we're going to get into some sort of a trade war between the U.S. and Mexico and China that we could get caught up in inadvertently. Canada's not the target of U.S. anger on trade, and Mr. Trump said that actually at the meeting with Prime Minister Trudeau this week. But nonetheless, we could still be affected by what unfolds. So there's that. There's also a lot of uncertainty about the future of Europe, not only because the UK is in the initial stages of leaving the European Union, but also because there are elections coming up this year in several of the big European countries where the future of the euro, I think, is really going to be one of the key issues in debate. So Europe is, 20% of the world. So the structure of the Eurozone and the kind of architecture for the single currency and so on does have implications for the broader world, even including Canada. So that's another kind of uncertainty we're facing. It's too early to know what is likely to happen, but there does seem to be a political commitment in Washington to dealing with this large pool of undocumented immigrants, foreign workers, basically. There's over 11 million foreigners living in the United States who do not have the legal papers to be there, which is, that's understandably a big topic of political debate down there. Mr. Trump and the Republicans, and I think, are going to be taking some measures to accelerate the deportation of people who are there illegally. And I'm not passing judgment on that, but I'm just saying a lot of those illegal workers or illegal residents actually work in various kinds of service industries, agriculture, construction, landscaping, retail, meat packing plants, and so on. And if large numbers of them are deported, it's going to, in a sense, reduce the supply of labor in the U.S. at a time where they're already running close to full employment. So it's something to keep an eye on. A few thousand being deported doesn't matter, but if we get into millions, then that could begin to affect the performance of the labor market.
And how does that affect us? Like, will we get more skilled workers out of this if it happens?
I think we do have a chance, and there's sort of anecdotal evidence already beginning to come to the surface on this. If the U.S. is perceived to be less welcoming of foreign workers and students, there are hundreds of thousands of foreign students enrolled in U.S. universities and colleges, and we've been trying to attract more of those folks into Canada. I could see a scenario where Canada becomes more appealing in the eyes of skilled foreign workers and students relative to the U.S. So I don't think we're going to see a huge flood, but we could begin to tilt things a bit more in our favor. So that's an upside for Canada.
I guess next I'd ask, in terms of how Canada's doing generally, you said that BC is doing a lot better than Canada is. Maybe you could explain some of the factors for that.
Yeah, well, we don't produce oil, and so we're not hit the way Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland were by the tremendous declines in oil prices in 2014, 15, and indeed all the way through the first quarter of 2016. And in fact, we're a net consumer of oil, not producer. So arguably, we might have even benefited a bit from lower prices. But so that's number one. Number two, we've got an economy that's been fueled by housing starts, housing investment, real estate transactions, also by demographic growth. Our population is expanding about 1% a year, which doesn't sound like much, but a lot of provinces are actually close to zero. So we have stronger population growth. That creates demand for housing, demand for retail goods and services. We also have seen strength in tourism's had a couple of really strong years in BC. The high-tech industry is growing very rapidly. Film production has been running at record levels, film and TV production. We've seen even lumber and pulp have actually been quite strong, notwithstanding the question mark over the softwood agreement. And even in 2016, mining and minerals came back after a 5-year slump. We saw zinc prices, coal prices retrace some of the losses that they'd made earlier. So all of that fed into a relatively strong economy in the province, leading the country in the last 2 years in growth.
You were saying that BC is doing well construction-wise residentially, but it's a little shakier when it gets to non-residential.
Yeah, it's challenging. I mean, we've seen investment in office towers and some retail complexes. The Tuason Mills project, that's over $1 billion that was executed successfully in 2016. But some indicators of what we as economists would call capital formation have been quite weak. So this is investment in plant, factories, equipment, technology, intellectual property products, things that we need to build in order to really set the foundation for higher productivity and improved competitiveness. So it is an area we're doing some work on, and we have been urging the government to pay more attention to improving the investment climate for those kinds of investments, because that's really where BC's been lagging. And it's not, we don't have all the explanation as to why that is. Taxes are a part of it, but it goes beyond that, I think.
And you, to use your term, said governments are both sucking and blowing when it comes to interest rates. Maybe you could explain that.
Well, I'm just saying in Canada, the paradox is we've got record high levels of household indebtedness. Our finance minister in Ottawa and the central bank, the Bank of Canada, have been expressing concern about this for years. And yet interest rates have been operating at record lows for 5 or 6 years now, which encourages people to take on more debt. And to some extent, certainly after the crisis in 2008-9, governments were encouraging people to take on debt in order to help the economy recover. So that's why I say governments do have a bit of a habit of talking out of both sides of their mouth. But the dilemma is they have limited policy tools to work with to really stimulate the economy.
And how badly do you think it would, all these other possibly unstable elements like the Eurozone and like the U.S., how would that affect interest rates detrimentally or to the good for us?
Well, I think if the global economy takes a hit because of a U.S.-China trade war or because of the unraveling of the European Union, that's going to have a negative effect on global growth, which will put downward pressure on interest rates. The problem is interest rates are already near zero, at least central bank rates, so there's not much more room on the downside. So we don't want to see those negative external developments come to the fore. We don't want a trade war between the U.S. and China. We don't want the European arrangements to unravel, because that, I think, would be dangerous for the world, and it would wash over our borders and affect us even though we have no jurisdiction over any of it.
And finally, you were talking about how there's really good employment here, but here being the Lower Mainland. Maybe you could speak to how that could be improved upon, or will it be improved upon?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the job market in BC, it has been a bit of a tale of two economies for the past few years. It's really been almost all of the net employment growth has been in the Lower Mainland, a little bit in southern Vancouver Island in the last year or so, and most other regions have been flat or even declining. Part of that is demographics. So when you think about population growth in British Columbia, it's preponderantly being driven by immigration, and immigration is overwhelmingly in the urban centers. 90% of new immigrants to BC settle within 100 kilometers of downtown Vancouver. So that's one factor. And then the second is the commodity cycle. The regions outside BC are more exposed to the ups and downs of coal markets, lumber markets, pulp markets, seafood markets, energy markets. And we've gone through a 5 or 6 year period where there's been weakness in a number of those commodity segments, and that's had quite a negative effect on the interior, the northeast, the northwest. Even though people are talking about LNG in the future, LNG doesn't exist right now. So it will take an improvement in the commodity cycle from a BC perspective, I think, to turn things around for a lot of the regions of the province. The government can help a bit with infrastructure investments and ensuring that there's a stable foundation in place for some of these communities to weather the storms. But ultimately, it's really not up to the government the government doesn't control whether the caribou is growing at 1% or 2% or minus 1%. It's very difficult for policy to really influence that.
All right, so that was Jock Finlayson, and as I mentioned before, I went to the Wood Design and Construction Solutions Conference, and I had a talk with their executive director, Lynn Embury-Williams, who goes into the conference and what they hope to achieve and what they have achieved, and just sort of the general trend of what's going on with wood, specifically in British Columbia, but across the country and even across the world.
Done this conference before. How many of these have you done?
So my name's Lynn Embury-Williams. I'm the Executive Director of Woodworks BC. And each year, it's usually been in the fall, we host a one-day Wood Solutions Fair. And it's a pretty similar format where we have several streams, so five streams with 6 speakers per stream. So it's a lot of content. We have an exhibit hall and we provide opportunities for networking. And this conference is actually 2 of those days, so it's double the one day, which is quite something. We have 38 speakers. We have an expanded exhibit hall. It's pretty well functioning in the same way, but we have some people coming to day 1 or day 2, and then some coming to the whole conference.
And is that because of increased demand for wood projects, or what's the trend line here?
Well, the trend line is growing. There is an increased demand. We used to focus primarily on designers, on reaching out, to architects, engineers. And so we have a great concentration of architects and engineers who design in wood here. They're now designing all over the world. But now we have discovered there's a need to assist more to the construction sector and the regulatory sector such as the building code officials, fire officials, and even municipalities are looking to find how they can build their next major public buildings in wood. So there is an expansion. There's an expansion of audiences and of different types of demand.
Yeah, there has been quite a diverse section of seminars. Maybe you could go into a few of the different ones that you have besides design, although you've had good design ones as well.
Well, yeah, so we always have an architectural stream where, the content tends to be very inspirational. A lot of the very latest beautiful, beautiful buildings being designed. We have more of an engineering or a technical stream. So it's quite different than the architectural. It will get into the nitty-gritty. It tends to appeal more to engineers. And so they will, often the board is full of formulas and they're all eating it up. They learn how to apply certain products, such as CLT products, how to use them, how to deal with fire codes and things like that. We have an international stream, so we've invited a selection of just wonderful international speakers here. And so they will often, they'll speak on a variety of topics, but they bring global experience. And we have a special stream this year on curated by BC Wood, and so their focus tends to be architectural finishes and non-structural. So we had that stream, and then we had a sort of a research and development stream by FP Innovations. So that's they provided the latest, most recent research on some of these systems.
I was listening to one speaker from the Mosaic Center, and he said that he's been to Germany, and he's like, everybody thinks they're ahead, but they're not as ahead as we think they are. So maybe you could just describe how BC is kind of pulling ahead, or how they fare compared to the rest of the world.
Sure. Well, it's great to go to Europe and to see what they have done. I mean, they have a very vibrant timber industry. They have been well ahead in developing these new products like cross-laminated timber and other types of products. Their design capability is really amazing. So they have been very far ahead. They are now doing very, very complex structures, and certainly they were the first region to really go tall with wood, and that's been clear. Canada has come a long way. The Woodworks program has been working for 18 years across the country, and in BC as well. And so while BC was behind, I think we are working well to catch up. But demand is different, the buildings are different, the requirements are different. So we're lucky here in this province. We have 2 of the tallest wood buildings in North America, one of the tallest in the world. So I think that says, how far we have come for sure.
Do you see any future projects or sort of future trends that are going to push BC forward in new directions with wood?
Oh, we're seeing a lot of projects. I mean, a number of them are still on the drawing board. But one thing that is happening is our designers here in BC who, have developed and honed their expertise here in British Columbia, they're expanding. They're now designing and they're working on projects all around the world, including Asia, which, in China is just rocketing ahead. But they use BC timber and they, are using BC's designers. So based on what I know that is being talked about, certainly buildings are looking to go taller, and we're developing that expertise. Here in the Lower Mainland, we have a real need for affordable housing. We have a need for certain forms of densification, things like that. So that's where wood plays a great role, and so I can see a lot of innovation happening in those areas in the future. Yeah.
Is there anything I'm not asking about this conference that you think should be highlighted?
Well, I think there's lots to be highlighted here. I mean, I have to mention the exhibit hall. And so in the exhibit hall, we have all of, many of the suppliers and timber design experts, the companies that build the products, that develop the products, that provide all the fire stopping and all of the elements that go into a building that allow it to be built today to showcase wood. So I think that's just a wonderful feature. Most of these suppliers have been in business for many, many, many years. So they've been at the forefront. They've been supplying the designs. So they are true experts. They're global experts themselves. So that's a highlight. What I've really enjoyed, we had there's been lots of chances for networking. So we have these very esteemed international speakers have come over, and they are just, in many cases, they've worked with some BC designers, so they've gotten together again. But the conversations are amazing. They're just wonderful. We also have a lot of students here. So we have a lot of young practitioners. We made it affordable for them to come because we want them to come and see what can be possible and to learn and to get to know wood. So those are some of the highlights, I would say.
And are there, if you had to pick like 1 or 2 projects that you've highlighted in seminars here, what would they be?
Oh boy, that's 1 or 2 projects. I mean, I guess you'd almost have to talk about Brock Commons because it is the tallest wood structure in the world right now. I don't know. We have our Wood Design Awards coming up next week, so we have many, many featured fantastic projects. Another one that has won a lot of awards is the Grandview swimming pool center that was designed by Paul Fast. We've seen quite a bit of that. Very innovative roof structure there. And there's a number more. I can't think of them all, but they're there. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Lynn.
All right, that was Lynn Embury-Williams, and now we've got 2 leads from the Morning Blueprint. The Morning Blueprint is our company newsletter that gets sent out, and so first one is there's a pre-qualification of general contractors underway for the Don River and Central Waterfront Wet Weather Flow Project Coxwell Bypass Tunnel in Toronto, Ontario.
Rolls off the tongue.
It really does. Yeah. Russ, what's the next one?
Well, we also have something going on at the British Columbia Institute of Technology. They're looking to pre-qualify up to 8 general contractors for upcoming various construction projects valued between $200,000 and $5 million in Burnaby, BC.
Ooh. All right, so for more information on those construction leads and more, powered by Construct Connect, call 1-800-424-3996. And that looks like it wraps it up for me and you, Russ, and for Vince and Lindsey in Toronto. So I'd just like to say thanks.
Yeah, thank you for listening, everybody.
And on behalf of Vince and Lindsey, I'm sure they say thanks as well for listening to our inaugural podcast. Thank you and good day.